For Carol Costello, good to be with you this morning, and thank you for being with me. After days of accusations and diplomatic finger-pointing between the U.S. and Israel, Secretary of State John Kerry is set to lay out a roadmap to peace for the Middle East. Now, the speech is set to begin at the top of the hour, and it comes after the U.S. refused to veto this UN resolution condemning Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. It's a move that infuriated Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And President-elect Trump is not staying silent, unleashing on the Obama administration this morning on Twitter, saying that Israel has been treated with disdain and disrespect. We're covering this major speech from every angle with the latest on what we should expect to hear from the Secretary and in-depth analysis on what this means going forward. Let's start now with CNN Global Affairs correspondent Elise Labott at the State Department. Elise, everybody here kicking, right? John Kerry leaves office in 3 weeks. Will this speech have any lasting effect beyond January 20th?
Well, Victor, I don't think Secretary Kerry expects that his words will resonate right now. But after working on this issue for the last 4 years, and you remember Secretary Kerry led that year-long effort to try and get a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians, he wants to lay out his vision, I think, what the U.S. had put on the table and how they see this issue being resolved. Obviously, the Secretary and President Obama are leaving office without having concluded a deal. The Trump administration will be coming in and will want to take a look at it themselves. But Secretary Kerry is going to outline what he thinks a deal could look like, because he hopes at some point that the parties will want to get back to the table and try and negotiate a deal, because that's really the only way the conflict will be resolved. And you know that this deal is very probably similar to what previous presidents have tried to get the parties to agree to in previous administrations. You remember the Clinton parameters. You remember President Bush had this Annapolis process. And so I think the contours of what a deal could look like are generally known. I think what you'll hear from Secretary Kerry today is a call for the parties to think about whether they're ready to make the painful compromises and difficult choices that are needed for peace, Victor.
All right, Elise Labott for us there at the State Department. Elise, thank you so much. And be sure to head to CNN.com. Check out Elise's new piece, John Kerry's Mission to Save Diplomacy. It's there in the politics section, again, at CNN.com. Now, this morning, the president-elect is weighing in on U.S. relations with Israel while also taking aim at the man he will soon succeed. Senior Washington correspondent Jeff Zeleny is in Florida. And Jeff, good morning to you. Donald Trump is, as he has in the last several weeks, gone straight to Twitter to speak about the big issues, 140 characters at a time. What is he saying?
Good morning, Victor. He is indeed, within the last several minutes, he is giving his opinion, a rebuttal, if you will, to the Secretary of State's speech that is coming up in the next hour. And of course, he has been a very talking about how the Obama administration simply is not a friend of Israel. Let's take a look at these tweets he sent this morning, Victor. The first was, "We cannot continue to let Israel be treated with such total disdain and disrespect. They used to have a great friend in the U.S., but," he continues, "not anymore. The beginning of the end was the horrible Iran deal, and now this UN. Stay strong, Israel. January 20th is fast approaching." So Donald Trump clearly going after the UN decision last week, and again the Obama administration's policy generally toward Israel, but not much room for specifics or explanation there as he's giving these messages in 140 characters at a time. Victor, also going after President Obama, continuing his taking aim at him for a comment that the president made a couple days ago, saying he would have won the election. And it also appears to be responding to a comment that the president made yesterday in Hawaii when he talked about the vitriol in our politics. Donald Trump was tweeting this. He said, "Doing my best to disregard the many inflammatory President O's statements and roadblocks. I thought it was going to be a smooth transition. Not." So clearly, Victor, 23 days before Donald Trump takes office from President Obama, clearly things not as smooth as they once seemed after the election when they met side by side in the Oval Office. Unclear if this is just on the surface or if there are real.
Right now, let's talk about what this means going forward. I'm joined now by David Andelman, editor emeritus at the World Policy Journal, and Daniel Kurtzer, former ambassador to Israel and Egypt, who just returned from Jerusalem yesterday. Gentlemen, good morning to both of you. Mr. Ambassador, I want to start with you and your sense of if this outrage that we are seeing and hearing from the Prime Minister, how widespread is that?
Well, there's a mixed view in Israel. I think there's a certain amount of confusion as to why the United States abstained on this resolution. On the other hand, the Israeli population is of a mixed mind on the issue of settlements, which is the underlying problem that caused this resolution to be passed. There's also a tremendous amount of pushback in the Israeli media against the rather inflammatory rhetoric being used by the Prime Minister against the President and the United States. Nobody can understand what has driven Mr. Netanyahu to use such language at this time.
David, are you expecting anything new today?
I think it will be a compilation of a whole lot of things that have been set up until now. I think what is particularly interesting is the fact that it does kind of bookend. In June of 2009, he went to Cairo and he gave an enormous hearing, which didn't work out so well. I think what Kerry is likely to do now is to try to set up his heritage, his inheritance, his going forward, his legacy for the future, and that of Obama as well. And I think that's what he's really hoping to see. What he's also hoping to see is to set out parameters that all of the rest of the Security Council and the rest of the world can embrace, that may perhaps force the Israelis to take some kind of an action that they may have been reluctant to take without that kind of a setup.
Mr. Ambassador, to you, one man's policy vision, which we're hearing from the Secretary today, can be another man's lecture. How is this likely to be received there by Benjamin Netanyahu, and what does he have to do to potentially, as he has many goals and many things that have to be accomplished in this speech, to quell some of the concerns that you just talked about?
Well, even without the dispute over the settlements resolution, Netanyahu would not be in a good mood to hear what the Secretary has to say, because U.S. policy and U.S. views on the core issues, territory, borders, security, refugees, and so forth, are not congruent exactly with those of Israel. At the same time, the Palestinians are not going to be entirely happy with what the Secretary has to say, because he's looking for some ground that might be bridgeable in a negotiation. So you now have a backdrop of a dispute over a settlements resolution in which the Secretary of State is going to outline a vision for the future, and I think you're going to get a very, very strong reaction out of Israel, somewhat milder reaction out of the Palestinians, but they are also not going to be entirely happy with what the Secretary has to say.
Ambassador, let me stay with you and this canceled vote overnight from the Jerusalem City Council to discuss construction on almost 500 additional units there in East Jerusalem. That was canceled reportedly at the request of the Prime Minister. Is that a gesture of good faith? How should the U.S. read that?
Well, I think it is a move by the Prime Minister to not further inflame the situation, but I would expect that the shoe will drop relatively soon. This government in Israel traditionally has a way of responding to attacks on its settlements policy by building more settlements. I think the Prime Minister understands that at this moment it would not be tactically wise to do so. I would not be surprised after the Secretary of State's speech if we see a revival of some of these ideas.
David, to you, we were talking during the break that this is not unprecedented to have a statement specifically on Middle East peace on the way out of the door from an administration.
Right. That's exactly what Bill Clinton did. Actually, 12 days before he left office in 2000, in January of 2000, he came out with his Clinton principles, if you will, and they were kind of a roadmap going forward for President Bush, which was very good because because they both believed in the two-state solution, unlike the current administration, which seems to believe only in a one-state solution and has indeed named an ambassador who is virulently in favor of a one-state solution.
The Trump administration.
I'm sorry, the Trump administration.
Okay. Yeah.
And going forward, this is very difficult. It places the United States in a very difficult position because really we are embracing a policy that is embraced only by one other country in the world, and that is the state of Israel.
David, finally to you, this question of the evidence that Israel says it has, this ironclad information, as the Prime Minister called it, that the U.S. pushed, orchestrated this resolution. There was a State Department official who said that the Secretary will touch on that. He has to do more than touch on it, doesn't he?
Well, he does to a degree. Look, this was a resolution that was embraced by 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council, all four permanent members, except the United States, which simply abstained, and the 10 regular members. The entire world is really kind of effectively embraced the concept behind this proposal. So really, it's going to be very hard for much of the world to embrace any kind of...
All right, David Andelman, former Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, thank you both. All right, coming up, so much for rubbing elbows with President Obama. Now Donald Trump is lobbing Twitter insults at him in just the last few minutes. What this means for the transition potentially. That's next.